The Cartographer of Still Water. Laying plans. The sunken cities of the Vessel Sea had never been conquered in 800 years of recorded history by any single power, not because they were strong, for none of the 7 island city-states could field more than a few thousand soldiers between them, but because no outside power had ever managed to hold all 7 at once, the currents and reefs and shifting sandbars of the Vessel Sea being, in the words of every sailor who had tried to chart them, the labyrinth that redraws itself every spring tide out of pure spite for anyone who thinks he has finally learned it. It was this reputation, more than any fleet or fortress, that had kept the sunken cities free for 8 centuries, and it was this reputation that the Calvorine Maritime Concordat intended, in the autumn of the year the histories would later call the Reckoning, to finally shatter. The Concordat was not, strictly speaking, a kingdom. It was something newer and in some ways more dangerous, a trading alliance of 11 mainland ports that had, over the preceding 2 decades, pooled their fleets, their capital, and their considerable appetite for expansion into a single unified naval power large enough to consider what no mainland state had ever seriously attempted. Not merely raiding the sunken cities, as pirates and privateers had always done, but occupying all 7 of them at once, permanently, and folding their extraordinary reef fisheries and pearl beds and the deep, sheltered anchorages that made them the finest natural harbors in the known sea into the Concordat's own expanding commercial empire. They brought, by the most careful counts available to the sunken city's 7 governing councils, some 140 warships and perhaps 11,000 marines, a force that outmatched the combined naval strength of all 7 cities by a factor of nearly 6 to 1, and against which the sunken city's traditional defense, which had always relied more on the sea's own treachery than on any fleet of their own, seemed. To most of the anxious counselors gathered in emergency session on the city of Ilmera that autumn, to offer no realistic hope at all. It was into this council, uninvited and largely unknown outside her own small guild, that a cartographer named Tessely Vrain walked on the 3rd day of deliberations, carrying under her arm a set of charts that no council member present had ever seen, and that she had spent, by her own account, the better part of 11 years quietly compiling. "You are the harbor cartographer of Ilmera," said Councillor Dorsch, recognizing her only vaguely, as one recognizes a tradesperson one has occasionally passed in a market square. "This council is discussing matters of war." "I am aware," Tessely said, "and I would ask the council's patience for the length of one explanation, because I believe the matter of war and the matter of charts are, in this particular case, the very same matter, looked at from 2 directions that most of you have never had cause to consider together." A waging war. Tessely Vrain had spent the 11 years since her apprenticeship charting not the open sea lanes that merchant captains cared about, but the shallow, shifting, treacherous inshore waters around all 7 sunken cities, the sandbars that moved with every spring tide, the reef channels that flooded and drained on cycles no outsider had ever bothered to properly record, the deep-water anchorages hidden behind barrier reefs that looked, from any approaching ship, like nothing more than open water breaking dangerously on submerged rock. It was tedious, unglamorous work, the kind that had earned her a modest living and no particular reputation beyond her own small guild of harbor cartographers, who valued her charts for their usefulness to local fishing captains and paid her, correspondingly, a local cartographer's modest wage. She had never imagined, in 11 years of quietly refining the most detailed charts of the vessel sea's treacherous inshore waters that had ever existed, that this labor would one day be the only thing standing between the sunken cities and conquest. The Concordat commands 140 warships, she told the council, unrolling the first of her charts across the long table, and every one of those ships is built and crewed for open water, deep-hulled, heavily armed, designed to dominate the wide sea lanes where Concordat trade and Concordat power have always been built. That is their strength, and it is real, and I do not propose to pretend otherwise. But it is also, if the council will permit me to say so, the entirety of their strength, and it is a strength that exists only in open water. Every one of the sunken cities sits behind a maze of reefs, sandbars, and tidal channels that no deep-hulled warship can safely navigate without a local pilot, channels that shift with every season, that flood and drain on cycles the Concordat's mainland. Charts, however excellent for open water, have never had reason to record, because no mainland power has ever needed to bring a war fleet through them before. I have spent 11 years recording exactly how those channels shift, exactly which sandbars move and which stay fixed, exactly which reef passages flood deep enough for a heavy warship at which state of tide, and exactly which ones will strand a ship of any real size the moment the water begins to fall. The Concordat's fleet cannot simply sail into our harbors and land 11,000 Marines at their leisure, whatever their numbers suggest. They must first find their way through waters that I know better than any living person, mainland or islander both, because I am, so far as I have ever been able to determine, the only person who has ever bothered to chart them completely. That is not a small advantage, counselors. In a war fought entirely in these waters, it may be the only advantage that actually matters. Attack by stratagem. The council's admiral, a weathered veteran named Corvin Ask, who had spent 40 years commanding the modest fleets of Ilmera, and had watched, with growing dread, the Concordat's war fleet assemble on the mainland horizon over the preceding month, studied Thessaly's charts for a long while before speaking. "You are proposing we fight this war in the shallows," he said finally, "rather than meeting them in open water, where their numbers would simply overwhelm us in a single engagement." "I am proposing we do not fight the war they believe they are coming to fight at all," Thessaly said. "Every Concordat War Council for the past 2 decades has planned this campaign, I would wager, around the assumption that their 140 warships need only reach the sunken cities in force to guarantee victory, that the difficulty lies entirely in the crossing, and that once their fleet arrives off our coasts, the actual conquest will be straightforward, since no combined fleet the sunken cities could possibly muster could hope to match their numbers in open engagement." "They are very likely correct about that last part, Admiral. We cannot beat 140 warships in open water with the 24 we could realistically field between all 7 cities. But they have never had to fight a war inside our reefs before, and I do not believe a single captain in their entire fleet has charted those reefs as thoroughly as I have, because until this autumn, no mainland power has ever needed to. My proposal, counselors, is this. We do not contest the open sea at all. We let the Concordat fleet approach unopposed, exactly as confidently as they intend to, and we withdraw every vessel we possess into the shallow, reef-choked inshore waters around each city, waters I have charted so completely that our pilots can move through them at speed, at any state of tide, in conditions that would ground or wreck any heavy Concordat warship attempting to follow. We do not need to defeat their fleet in a single battle. We need only make certain that every attempt they make to bring their numbers to bear against us costs them ships, time, and confidence, in water where our smaller, shallower vessels can strike and withdraw faster than their heavier ones can ever hope to follow, until a war they expected to win in a single season becomes a war of attrition fought entirely on terrain that favors us and punishes them, for as long as it takes their commanders to conclude that the conquest is not worth its rising cost. Tactical dispositions. The Concordat fleet arrived off the coast of Ilmera in the second week of that autumn, exactly as confidently as Thessaly had predicted. 140 warships spread across the horizon in a formation designed, quite reasonably by any conventional naval doctrine, to overwhelm whatever resistance the sunken cities might attempt to offer in open water. They found, to the considerable puzzlement of their overall commander, a grizzled and highly capable admiral named Ferrant Cool, no resistance at all in open water. The combined fleets of all 7 cities, some 24 vessels in total, smaller and more lightly armed than anything in the Concordat's own war fleet, had withdrawn entirely behind the reef lines, visible from a distance as little more than a scatter of masts anchored in what appeared, from the Concordat's excellent but entirely conventional mainland charts, to be a maze of dangerous shoal water that no sensible fleet would willingly enter. "They are cowering," said one of Cool's junior captains, at the war council held aboard his flagship on the evening of their arrival. "We should simply bombard the harbors from open water and force their surrender without ever needing to risk our ships in that reef maze at all." Ilmera's harbor sits nearly 2 miles behind the outer reef line, Cool said, studying his own charts with the particular frustration of a commander who suspects, correctly, the maps he has been given do not tell him everything he needs to know. We cannot bombard what we cannot see and cannot range against from open water. If we wish to take these cities, and the Concordat Council has made very plain that half measures will not satisfy the investment already committed to this campaign, we must eventually bring ships through those reefs and land Marines on those shores. The question is only how, and at what cost, and I confess I do not yet fully understand the water we are dealing with. He was, in this uncertainty, entirely correct to worry, though he could not yet have known just how thoroughly his mainland charts had failed him. The Concordat's cartographers, for all their genuine skill in charting the deep sea lanes that Concordat trade depended upon, had never had reason to chart the vessel's seas inshore shallows with anything like Thessaly Vrain's 11 years of patient, unglamorous attention, and the charts Cool's fleet actually possessed, gathered second-hand from merchant captains and the occasional privateer who had skirted these waters over the decades, were badly out of date. Missing entirely the seasonal shifts in sandbar and channel that Thessaly had spent over a decade tracking with an intimacy no outsider could hope to match. Alanurgy. The first Concordat attempt to force a passage came 4 days after their arrival, when Cool sent a squadron of 15 of his lighter warships toward what his charts indicated was the main channel into Ilmera's harbor, a channel that had indeed been the main passage some 6 years earlier, before a series of unusually severe spring tides had shifted the sandbars enough to close it almost entirely and open in its place. A narrower and far less obvious channel some 300 yards to the north, a shift that Tessely's own most recent survey had recorded in careful detail not 4 months prior. 11 of the 15 Concordat ships ran aground within the first hour of the attempt, their heavier hulls catching on sandbars that Cool's charts insisted did not exist, in water that his cartographers had assured him was safely navigable at the state of tide his squadron had chosen to attempt the passage. Of the 11 grounded vessels, 4 could be refloated on the following tide with considerable difficulty. The remaining 7, caught at awkward angles as the tide continued to fall, were battered by the reef itself until their hulls began to split, and were eventually abandoned entirely, their crews taken off by the 4 ships that had managed to withdraw, their cargo and much of their armament left to the reef and in short order. To small fast boats crewed by Ilmera fishermen who had watched the entire disaster unfold from the safety of the inner harbor and saw no particular reason to leave good salvage to the tide. It was, Tessely would later reflect, precisely the kind of victory she had hoped for from the very beginning of the campaign, not a battle won by superior force or even by superior tactics in any conventional sense, but a defeat inflicted on the enemy entirely by the water itself, guided only slightly by charts that told the defenders exactly where and when that water would do the enemy's work for them. 7 ships lost, and not a single arrow loosed by either side, Admiral Ask said, watching the wreckage from Ilmera's harbor wall with something between satisfaction and disbelief. I have fought 30 years of naval war, cartographer, and I have never seen an engagement quite like this one. That is rather the point, Tessely said. An engagement where the enemy is defeated by terrain he did not understand, rather than by force he might have matched or exceeded, is not a story any Concordat captain will be eager to repeat to his commanders. Admiral Cool lost 7 warships this morning without ever seeing an enemy vessel close enough to fight. That is a considerably harder defeat to explain to a war council than a battle lost to superior numbers or superior seamanship, because it offers no enemy strength to respect and no honorable excuse to offer, only the humiliating admission that his own charts were wrong, and that he sailed confidently into water he did not actually understand. Weak points and strong. Cool, to his credit, did not repeat the same mistake twice. He suspended any further attempt to force a passage until his own cartographers could survey the reef lines more carefully, a process that took the better part of 2 weeks, during which the Concordat fleet remained anchored in open water, its marines idle, its supply ships beginning the long and expensive business of ferrying fresh water and provisions across open sea from the nearest mainland port, since the sunken cities themselves, blockaded though they were, offered the fleet nothing in the way of local resupply. It was during these 2 weeks that Tessely made her second, and in the fullness of time, more consequential contribution to the defense of the sunken cities, not a chart this time, but a proposal so unconventional that it required the better part of a full council session to secure the 7 cities governing council's reluctant agreement. Admiral Cool will eventually survey our reefs accurately enough to find safe passages through them, she told the assembled council. He has skilled cartographers of his own, and 2 weeks and considerable motivation to avoid a second disaster like the first. When he does, he will bring his fleet through in force, at whatever channels his surveys eventually identify as safe, and no chart advantage of mine will prevent that eventually happening, because charts alone cannot hold a channel closed forever against a patient enough enemy. What I propose instead is this: we allow his surveys to succeed, in part. We do not try to hide every safe channel from his cartographers, which I do not believe is possible against a determined enough survey effort in any case. Instead, we make certain that the channels his surveys eventually confirm as safe are precisely the channels where our own smaller vessels, faster, shallower drafted, and crewed by pilots who have sailed these waters their entire lives, can strike his ships as they pass through in the narrow, exposed passage between the outer reef and the inner harbor, where his numbers cannot be brought to bear all at once, where only a handful of his ships can pass through any given channel at any given time, and where our own vessels can withdraw into water too shallow for his heavier ships to follow the moment any engagement turns against us. We cannot defeat his fleet in open water, and we cannot hold every reef channel closed to him forever. But we can make certain that every channel he does eventually find costs him ships and marines in a bottleneck fight that favors us, for as long as this campaign continues to seem, to the Concordat Council funding it, worth the ships and men it keeps consuming. Maneuvering. It took Admiral Cool's cartographers just under 3 weeks to identify, with reasonable confidence, 4 channels through the reef line at Ilmera that a heavy warship could navigate safely at high tide, a genuine achievement, given the treacherous and constantly shifting nature of the waters they were surveying, though one that came at the cost of 2 further ships lost to reefs and sandbars during the survey process itself. Losses that Cool reported back to the Concordat Council, with growing unease about the true cost of this campaign. When the assault through those 4 channels finally came, in the 4th week of the siege, it was a far more careful and better prepared operation than the first disastrous attempt. Squadrons of Cool's lighter, more maneuverable vessels leading the way at precisely the state of tide his surveys indicated was safest, heavier ships following in their wake once the channels had been confirmed clear. What Cool's careful survey had not told him, because Tessely had made certain of it through nearly 3 weeks of quiet, deniable interference, false soundings reported by fishing boats that appeared, to any distant Concordat observer, to be simply going about their ordinary business, buoys and channel markers subtly repositioned under cover of darkness. A handful of local pilots who had, for reasons that seemed at the time like simple mercenary opportunism, offered their services to Concordat surveyors as guides through the reef, and who had, with exquisite subtlety, guided those surveys toward channels that were indeed navigable, but that funneled any following fleet directly past a series of shallow-water ambush points that Tessely's fishing boat allies had spent weeks quietly preparing, was that the 4 channels his cartographers had identified, while genuinely safe from grounding, ran in every case through narrow stretches of water no more than 80 yards wide, flanked on both sides by shallows where Ilmera's own small, fast vessels could lie in wait, invisible against the reef itself, until a Concordat squadron was already committed to the passage and unable to easily turn back against the ships following behind it. The battle that followed, if battle is even the right word for an engagement fought across 4 narrow channels simultaneously, in confused, close-quarters fighting where numbers mattered far less than maneuverability and local knowledge of every hidden shoal and cross-current, cost Admiral Cool 18 more ships and nearly 1,000 Marines, against losses on the Ilmera side of only 6 small vessels and perhaps 200 men. It was not, by any measure, a battle that destroyed the Concordat fleet, which still possessed, even after these losses, well over 100 ships and 10,000 Marines. But it was, Thessaly understood clearly even as the smoke cleared over the reef line that evening, exactly the kind of cost that a distant, profit-minded council of 11 Mainla Yendi ports would eventually find harder and harder to justify against a campaign that had promised quick, cheap conquest, and was instead delivering only steadily mounting losses in exchange for a single city not yet even properly besieged, let alone taken. Variation in tactics. It was at this point in the campaign, roughly 6 weeks after the Concordat fleet's arrival, that Admiral Cool, a competent and increasingly desperate commander who understood, better than the Council funding him from the safety of the mainland, exactly how badly this war was beginning to go, made the decision that Thessaly had, from the very earliest days of the siege, hoped he would eventually be forced into. Rather than continue the costly, grinding business of forcing narrow reef channels 1 squadron at a time, Cool decided to split his remaining fleet, sending perhaps 60 ships to blockade Ilmera while directing the bulk of his remaining force, some 70 ships and 8,000 Marines, toward the neighboring city of Vesport, a smaller, and according to his by now considerably more accurate charts, somewhat less treacherously defended harbor, in the hope that a quicker, cheaper victory there might restore momentum to a campaign that was rapidly losing whatever confidence the Concordat Council back home had once had in it. This was, Thessaly explained to the assembled council of all 7 cities, for the war had by this point become a matter for all 7 governing bodies rather than Ilmera alone, a coordination that had taken considerable diplomatic effort on Thessaly's own part to arrange, since the 7 cities had never in 8 centuries fought a war as a truly unified force before, precisely the moment their defense needed to demonstrate the second half of its design. The half that depended not on any single city's reef charts, but on the 7 cities' willingness, for the first time in their long history, to act as a single coordinated power rather than 7 proudly independent ones. Vesport's own reef defenses are real but less extensive than Ilmera's, Thessaly told the assembled councillors, because Vesport has always relied more on Ilmera's naval strength than its own. In the informal way, all 7 cities have always relied on one another, without ever quite formalizing the arrangement. If Vesport must face Admiral Cool's 70 ships alone, it will very likely fall, whatever chart advantage its own harbor pilots possess, because 60 ships blockading Ilmera can still be brought to Vesport's aid within 2 days' sail once wind and tide allow. But 2 days is more than enough time for 8,000 Marines to establish an unbreakable beachhead if Vesport faces them entirely alone in the interim. I propose, therefore, that we do the thing none of the 7 cities has ever done in 800 years of independent history. That Ilmera's fleet, small as it now is after these 6 weeks of fighting, quietly slipped through the Concordat's own blockade, using precisely the reef knowledge that has protected us this entire campaign, but this time to escape rather than to defend and reinforce Vesport before Cool's assault force arrives, so that when his 70 ships reach Vesport's reefs, they find not the modest, semi-independent defense his intelligence has led him to expect, but the combined strength of two cities' pilots. Two cities' small, fast vessels, and two cities' accumulated reef knowledge, applied together against a single assault force that believed it was attacking the weaker of two targets. The army on the march. The passage of Ilmera's remaining fleet through the Concordat blockade, undertaken on a moonless night with a falling tide that Thessaly's charts indicated, would expose a narrow, little-used channel along the reef's northern edge for perhaps 90 minutes before the rising water closed it again, remains, among the surviving accounts of that campaign, one of the more remarkable feats of seamanship the vessel sea's long naval history has to offer, not because it involved any battle at all, but because it involved none. Some 40 small, shallow-drafted vessels slipping past 60 blockading Concordat warships in near-total darkness through water so treacherously shallow that not one of the blockading captains, watching from stations they believed covered every viable passage, ever suspected that an escape was even physically possible along that particular stretch of reef. They reached Vesport 2 days later, exhausted but essentially intact, in time to spend a further 2 days working with Vesport's own pilots to prepare a coordinated defense that drew, in its broad design, directly on the lessons of the fighting at Ilmera. Reef channels quietly steered toward ambush points, false soundings offered to any Concordat surveyor who could be reached, and the combined small vessel fleets of both cities positioned to strike at exactly the narrow, congested moments when a large as salt force attempting to force a passage would be least able to bring its numbers to bear. When Admiral Cool's 70 ships arrived off Vesport, expecting the modest, semi-independent resistance his intelligence had led him to anticipate, they found instead a defense reinforced by an enemy fleet that his own blockade, only days earlier, had believed still safely contained within Ilmera's harbor, a discovery that arrived, for Cool personally, with the particular sinking dread of a commander realizing, all at once, that the war he believed himself to be fighting bore only a passing resemblance to the war he was actually caught in. Terrain. The battle for Vesport's approaches, fought over the better part of a week in fitful, running engagements across the reef lines, cost Cool a further 24 ships before he finally abandoned the assault entirely and withdrew his remaining force to rejoin the blockade at Ilmera, a retreat that brought his total losses, across the full 10 weeks of the campaign to that point, to something approaching 60 ships and nearly 4,000 Marines. Against a Concordat war fleet that had arrived that autumn numbering 140 ships and 11,000 men. It was around this time, reconstructed in later accounts from captured Concordat correspondence that found its way eventually into the sunken city's own archives, that the Concordat Council back on the mainland began the private, increasingly urgent deliberations that would, within another 2 months, end the campaign entirely. We were told this conquest would pay for itself within the first season, from the pearl beds and reef fisheries alone, one council member wrote, in a letter later recovered from a captured Concordat supply vessel, addressed to a fellow investor in the campaign. We have instead spent 3 seasons' worth of Concordat naval strength attempting to force passage through waters that seem, the longer this campaign continues, to defend themselves more effectively than any enemy fleet we have ever faced, at a cost that has already exceeded what conquest of all 7 cities could plausibly return to us, even in a decade of uninterrupted profit. I begin to wonder whether the wiser course was never conquest at all, but the trading arrangement several of the smaller port cities proposed to us privately 3 years ago, before this entire expedition was ever approved. That such a letter existed at all, that a member of the Concordat's own investing council had, within a private communication never intended for any sunken city's eye, begun to question the campaign's basic wisdom in terms of profit and loss rather than honor or conquest, was to Thessaly Vrain the clearest possible confirmation that her original wager, laid before the Ilmera Council on the very first day of the crisis, had been correct from its earliest premise. That the Concordat was not, whatever its formidable naval strength, a power bound together by any loyalty deeper than shared profit, and that a campaign made costly and humiliating enough for long enough would eventually be abandoned not because it had been decisively defeated in battle, but because it had simply stopped making financial sense to the mainland investors who had funded it in the first place. The 9 situations. The final act of the campaign, when it came, was neither a great battle nor a formal surrender, but something closer to the quiet unraveling that had, 6 months earlier in a very different war, ended the Ostrith Confederation's invasion of a distant mainland kingdom, a parallel Thessaly herself was unaware of, having never heard of Inez Corvain or the Feng River campaign, though the 2 women, separated by an ocean and a different kind of terrain entirely, had arrived by their own separate roads at strikingly similar conclusions about the nature of wars fought by coalitions bound only by shared expectation of easy profit. Word reached the sunken cities, carried by a Concordat merchant captain who had no particular loyalty to the war and considerable interest in resuming ordinary trade as quickly as possible, that the Concordat Council's confidence in the campaign had fractured badly over the preceding month. Several of the 11 member ports, having borne a disproportionate share of the campaign's mounting costs in ships and men, had begun openly questioning whether the conquest was worth continuing at all. While others, less directly burdened, argued for pressing on rather than abandoning an investment already so costly, it seemed a waste to walk away from without some return. It was Thessaly once again who proposed the final and in some ways most audacious move of the entire campaign, not a battle, but an offer, delivered through the same merchant captain intermediary, addressed not to Admiral Cool, whose personal reputation was by now too closely tied to the campaign's failure for him to accept any resolution short of victory W. Without considerable personal cost, but directly to the Concordat Council itself, over Cool's head, in a manner calculated to appeal precisely to the fracture already visible in the Council's own private correspondence. The offer was simple and framed with deliberate, careful modesty. The 7 sunken cities, having demonstrated at considerable cost to both sides that outright conquest of their waters was neither quick nor cheap nor, in the end, likely to succeed at all, would agree instead to exactly the kind of formal, favorable trading arrangement that several smaller Concordat ports had apparently proposed years before the invasion was ever launched preferential access to the reef fisheries and pearl beds for Concordat merchants. A share of the harbor fees at all 7 cities, considerable natural anchorages, and formal trading rights that would deliver, over time, very likely more genuine profit to the Concordat's member ports than outright conquest could ever have provided, given the cost that conquest had already proven itself to carry, without requiring a single additional ship or marine to be risked in pursuit of it. You are offering them, in slightly better terms, almost exactly what they could have had before any of this began, Admiral Ask observed, when Thessaly first proposed the offer to the full council of 7 cities. I am offering them a way to end a war that has already stopped making financial sense to them, without anyone on their council needing to admit, in front of the others, that the entire campaign was a catastrophic misjudgment from its very first day, Thessaly said. A council fractured by mounting losses does not need to be defeated further. It needs only to be given a face-saving reason to stop. That lets every member claim some form of victory in the settlement, even though none of them achieved the conquest they originally set out to win. We have already shown them, at considerable cost to us as well as to them, that conquest is not available. What remains is simply to make certain that the alternative we offer looks, to a fractured and exhausted council, like the wiser choice they were capable of making all along, rather than the defeat it actually represents. An attack by fire. The Concordat Council debated the offer for the better part of 3 weeks, weeks in which Cool's remaining fleet, now reduced to barely 80 ships, and holding an increasingly threadbare blockade against a sunken city's defense that had, by this point in the campaign, grown bolder and more coordinated than at any previous stage, found itself subject to a final, sustained campaign of harassment that Thessaly had designed specifically to ensure the Council's deliberations concluded in the direction she hoped for. Fast raiding vessels, drawn now from all 7 cities acting in genuine and unprecedented coordination, struck at Cool's supply ships wherever they could be caught isolated from the main fleet, burning 3 heavily laden provision vessels in a single week through fireships launched under cover of darkness from shallow water no Concordat lookout thought to watch closely enough. Rumors, some true, most carefully exaggerated, all carried by merchant intermediaries who had, by this stage of the campaign, developed a considerable financial interest in seeing the war concluded so that ordinary trade could resume, reached the mainland ports, suggesting that further reinforcement of the campaign would be needed if conquest was to be achieved at all. Reinforcement that would cost individual member ports considerably more than their existing investment. A suggestion calculated to alarm precisely those council members already most reluctant to continue funding a war that had delivered nothing but losses for 3 full seasons. By the time the Concordat Council's response finally arrived, carried, fittingly enough, aboard the same merchant vessel that had first carried Thessaly's offer to the mainland, it accepted the trading arrangement substantially as proposed, with only minor adjustments to the harbor fee percentages that Thessaly herself considered entirely reasonable and recommended the 7 cities' councils accept without further negotiation. Since a war concluded a season earlier than it might otherwise have dragged on was worth considerably more, in her own calculation, than a marginally better fee arrangement squeezed from a council already looking for any reason to end the conflict. Admiral Cool withdrew his remaining fleet from the Vessel Sea in the following month, having lost. By the most careful count, the sunken city's own councils could assemble from captured logs and observed engagements. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 ships and 5,000 Marines across a campaign that had begun with every expectation of swift, decisive conquest and ended, 4 months later, in a negotiated trading arrangement that left all 7 cities formally independent. Considerably wealthy. Observed from the new Concordat trade, and this above all else, Thessaly herself would later reflect, no more conquered than they had been on the first morning the Concordat fleet appeared on the horizon. The use of spies. Cool himself did not survive the campaign's aftermath with much of his reputation intact. He was quietly relieved of his mainland naval command within the year, his career effectively ended by a defeat that no one on the Concordat Council wished to characterize too precisely, since doing so would require acknowledging just how thoroughly a fleet of 140 warships had been humiliated by 7 small island cities possessing, between them, barely 24 vessels worth the name at the campaign's outset. Thessaly Vrain, for her part, returned to her cartography guild in Ilmera within a month of the settlement signing, and resumed, with what her fellow guild members later described as an almost startling lack of ceremony, the same patient, unglamorous work of charting the vessel seas, shifting reefs and channels that she had performed for 11 years before the war ever began, work she continued, in fact, for another 3 decades. Expanding her original charts into what eventually became the single most comprehensive survey of the vessel sea's treacherous inshore waters ever compiled, a survey that outlived her by more than a century and remained, long after her death, the standard reference used by pilots and harbor masters across all 7 cities. She was offered, in the years immediately following the settlement, a formal seat on Ilmera's governing council, a title befitting the woman who had, by any honest accounting, saved all 7 cities from conquest, and a considerable pension that would have allowed her to retire from cartography entirely in comfort. She declined all 3, in terms strikingly similar, though she had no way of knowing it, to those a salt keeper on a distant mainland had once used to decline very similar honors after a very similar war. "I have no particular gift for governing," she told the Ilmera Council when they pressed her a second time on the matter, "and I would make, I suspect, rather a poor counselor, since I have spent my whole working life more interested in the shape of a sandbar than in the shape of an argument. What I am good at, and what I believe still needs doing, is charting water that changes every season in ways that will matter again, someday, to some future crisis none of us can presently foresee, because the Concordat will not be the last power to look at these islands and imagine an easy conquest, and whoever succeeds me in this work will need charts as current and as complete as the ones that carried us through this war, and charts of that quality do not make themselves. I would rather spend what years I have left making certain those charts exist and are kept properly current, than spend them arguing in council chambers about matters I am, by inclination and by training both, considerably less suited to than the study of tides. A final reckoning. In her final years, long after the Concordat trading arrangement had settled into the comfortable, mutually profitable routine that both sides had in the end found rather more agreeable than either had expected during the war itself, Tessely Vrain set down her own private account of the campaign, not for publication, which held no interest for her, but for the guild of harbor cartographers she had trained and would eventually leave her charts and her considerable accumulated knowledge to, in the hope that whoever came after her would understand not merely the shape of the reefs, but the reason that shape had once mattered so much more than any fleet of warships. "I am told," she wrote, in an account that survived, like Inez Corvain's ledger on a distant and unconnected mainland, largely by accident, tucked among the guild's ordinary working papers rather than preserved in any formal archive, that the Concordat's own naval academies still teach that campaign as a case study in the dangers of inadequate reconnaissance, a lesson about the importance of accurate charts, which is true as far as it goes, but which I have always thought misses the deeper lesson entirely. The lesson I would want any young cartographer of this guild to actually carry away from the story. It was never truly a war about charts, however much the charts mattered. It was a war about confidence, about a great and powerful coalition that believed, quite reasonably given its own strength, that its size alone guaranteed an easy victory, and that never once paused to ask what it did not know about the ground it intended to fight on, because a fleet of 140 ships does not, as a rule, imagine that its ignorance of a few reef channels could possibly matter against numbers so overwhelming. That confidence was the true weakness I set out to exploit from the very first day of the crisis, long before I had ever finished planning a single ambush or arranged a single false sounding. A confident enemy does not check his assumptions. He marches, or in this case sails, forward on the strength of numbers alone, and by the time he discovers that numbers were never the thing that mattered most in the particular water he chose to fight in, he has already lost far more than he can easily recover, in ways that cost his own side's confidence in him at least as dearly as it costs him in ships and men. I would not have you believe, whoever eventually reads this account, that charts alone won that war, however much I am given credit for them. Charts told us where the enemy's confidence was wrong. It was the Seven Cities' willingness, unprecedented in 800 years of proud independence, to act together, to trust one another's pilots and one another's fleets at the one moment it mattered most, that actually turned that knowledge into victory, and I have often thought that lesson mattered rather more than any single chart I ever drew, though it is a harder lesson to teach a young apprentice than the shape of a sandbar, since sandbars, at least, hold still long enough to be properly measured. Which is more than can be said for the pride of 7 proudly independent cities finally learning, in the middle of a war that nearly cost them everything, that they had always needed one another rather more than any of them had ever cared to admit. She died some years later in the same modest cartography house where she had spent her entire working life. Her final chart, a survey of a newly shifted channel off the coast of Vesport, completed only weeks before her death, left unfinished on her drafting table, to be completed by the apprentice she had spent her final decade training, a young woman named Pierre Kell, who would, in her turn, spend the whole of her own long career maintaining and expanding the great chart archive her teacher had built, and who would tell to her own apprentices in later years the story of the war that never needed a great fleet to win it, only a woman patient enough to have already learned, years before anyone thought to ask, exactly how the water moved.